because as you've learned, animal products are not the cause. There are even many cultures that eat high amounts of animal products with very little rates of chronic disease. The first example is a pretty cool story about Vilhjalmur Stefansson. He lived with the Inuits in the Canadian Arctic in the early 1900s. He lived with them for years and found they ate a diet primarily of about 70 to 80% fat. And this all came from animal fats, because what do you have in the Canadian Arctic? You don't have very many, if any, plants growing in that area. He recorded this in his book, Not by Bread Alone. And what he found and what he recorded in his work with them, that they lived long, healthy lives free of modern day diseases. Even when he returned back to the States in 1928, after living with the Inuits for years, he came home and wanted to conduct an experiment, a very controlled experiment. So he checked himself into Bellevue Hospital in New York City, and he was under strict supervision by the medical staff. What he did was, for a year in this hospital, he ate nothing but meat and water. That's all he did. And at the end of the year, the medical staff found that he was in perfect health. He had no nutritional deficiencies. He even continued to eat this way for the rest of his life because of how good he felt, he said. And he died at age 82 in perfect health. Now, the second example is with George Mann. He's a doctor and a professor of biochemistry. What he did was, in the 1960s, he traveled to Kenya, where he studied the Maasai. This is a traditional culture tribe that has been really living and thriving off of meat, organs, blood, and milk. A very high animal-based diet. Now, this was in the 1960s when all that science was going on. And so, knowing that there was an epidemic of heart disease going on in the world around him, in the Western world, where hundreds of thousands of individuals were dying from heart disease, and meat and animal fats were the culprit, or seemingly the culprit behind these issues, he found an entirely different phenomenon going on in the Eastern world. He found that the Maasai people ate meat, milk, and blood, and that's all they lived off of. But they had very low serum total cholesterol numbers. It's interesting to note. They would also drink 2 to 7 liters of milk per day and a half pound of butter fat. No vegetables were eaten because they wanted to save them for the cows. What he did was, he tested their blood pressure and their weight, and what he found is their blood pressure and their weight was 50% lower than the average American. And interestingly, this number didn't rise with age. The older they got, they still had lower numbers of weight and blood pressure. He even conducted EKGs on over 400 men and couldn't find a single case of heart disease. To go one step further, he performed autopsies on 50 Maasai men and only found one case where a heart attack may have occurred. So what he had determined from his visit is that, contrary to popular belief, it wasn't normal for humans to have rising blood pressure, rising weight, and rising cholesterol levels as a normal part of human aging. Now, to summarize George Mann's point here with a little bit more concrete evidence, there was a review of 26 papers studying various traditional cultures, and the authors concluded that when individuals live in more primitive conditions, quote, an increase in blood pressure was not a part of the normal aging process. So it would seem that whatever we're doing here in the Western world and more civilized societies is what's causing all the health issues that we're experiencing. And it just so happens that meat consumption, red meat consumption, because it's a part of our human history of what we've been doing for a very long time, it's associated with all these chronic health conditions that we're experiencing. Whereas the true culprits behind modern day diseases, as the evidence suggests, ultra-processed foods, sedentary behavior, lack of sleep, high chronic stress, and avoiding the sun, these are all the culprits for causing modern day disease. Now, another example of humans eating a relatively high meat-based diet without getting chronic disease, this is the Native Americans living in the Southwest. They were observed during the years 1898 and 1905. They were found to predominantly eat a diet that was high in buffalo meat. That is, until they were forced out of their traditional way of living. Now, what's interesting to note about these Native Americans is that according to our own 1900 US Census in America, Native American men lived to be 224 per million, whereas Native American women were 254 per million, compared to American men that were 3 per million, and American women 6 per million. Those rates are staggering. It was also noted in this report that none of these Native Americans were reported to have dementia, and they were all but free of chronic disease. While there are many factors that come into play here that could cause their good health, if they were eating meat-heavy diets, we can say for certain that eating a meat-heavy diet didn't cause any poor health outcomes in these Native Americans. But what about an example in America, in modern day America? Well, made popular by Malcolm Gladwell in his New York Times bestseller Outliers, he details the story of an Italian population living in Roseto, Pennsylvania. Shout out to my home state, Pennsylvania. This was conducted during the years 1955 to 1961, so right there during that prime age of all this research being conducted. Researchers found during this time that this population in Roseto, Pennsylvania stuck to their traditional ways of living, and they ate a high percentage of their diet coming from animal fats like tallow and lard, pemmican, and a lot of red meat. And what researchers found is they had strikingly low numbers of death from heart disease. That was compared to their neighboring towns that had higher rates of heart disease. So was there something special about them and their genetics that just caused this? Or did it show that a traditional diet, if you stuck to your roots and gave your body what it expected, and you avoided seed oils, and you avoided modern day unhealthy habits, you would be all but free of chronic disease?